Hey, so do you like getting actual stuff in the mail? I know I do. I mean, not like bills and spammy credit card offers and stuff, but real honest to goodness mail written specifically to you by another human. It happens less and less as we get more and more firmly entrenched into the internet, but I know I still get all silly and giddy when I get a piece of mail someone else has sent me. So it's in that spirit that I added another level to our page on patreon.com/The Atheist Manifesto. If you make a pledge of $10 per episode or more, you'll get an honest to goodness handwritten postcard from me with a picture in it at the end of each month. Each one will be made just for you. No two will ever be the same. I think it could be a really cool way for me to share with you what you're helping me do with the show and the stories you're helping me to tell. Also, speaking of patrons, big shout out this week to Doe and Freethinker215 for becoming new patrons this week. And big shout out to Anna for increasing your pledge this week. Patreon.com/The Atheist Manifesto. It all helps and it all makes a difference. Thank you, friends. Hello, dear friends, and welcome back to the Atheist Manifesto. I am your host, Callie Wright, and today on the podcast we have Dara Hoffman-Fox. Welcome, friend.
Hi, Callie. Thanks for having me on your show.
I am super excited about this. So, Dara is a gender therapist, and I am very interested in this because it's a niche that I think. When people think of therapists, they think of maybe a certain specific set of things like anxiety, depression, and that kind of stuff. And I don't know that that gender stuff factors into what people generally think of when they think of therapists or therapy. And I don't know, me personally, I think everyone should have a therapist regardless of what your status is mental health wise, because I actually went into therapy thinking that I didn't need it and that I was just there for like letters and stuff, and I ended up getting a lot out of it. But so I'm very interested in this, especially as a fellow person of the genders. My therapist was not trans, and I felt that limited her perspective in some ways. I also think it maybe gave her a certain level of objectivity that was helpful. And I'm sort of interested in navigating the sort of the interplay between being someone who is affected by this yourself and working with others who do. And I think part of the reason that I am so interested in this is like people tell me a lot that I would make a good therapist, like because I'm a good listener and like I think deeply about things. But my pushback is always like, no, I would make a terrible therapist because I am a super empathetic person to the point where it's actually it actually hurts my ability to be a friend sometimes because I get into other people's feelings, and I think that would make me a terrible therapist. So, so I'm interested in how all of this works. But first, would you mind just telling us a little bit of your story, a little bit of your background, how you got into this?
Yeah, I can't wait to talk about this other stuff too. So I thought I'd actually start with the term gender therapist, because I think you make a really good point in that some of this has some mystery, and I want to be able to deconstruct that for your listeners. So being a gender therapist, at least at this point in time, there's not something where I went ahead and got some kind of approval from some board or certification process. Really, at this point, therapists just call themselves gender therapists when they feel like they are ready to do so. And for me, that means that they have a certain amount of knowledge, and it can't, not just friendliness and not just awareness, but full-blown knowledge about working with trans clients. And that has to include not only just helping them explore their gender identity, but like with the transition process, writing letters, being able to advocate in case things get all screwed up with insurance companies and things like that, helping them with legal name change, legal gender marker change. And so it is good for everyone to know that to find a gender therapist, like there's lots of people that'll say maybe they work with trans clients, but really if someone calls themselves a gender therapist, you can hope and assume that means that they actually know what they're doing, either because they've had that many years of studying and education and experience, but it's still important to like interview the therapist to ask them about that to make sure. And so I decided in 2000, let me think, 2013. So it's been 5 years ago that it was okay. Like I was ready to call myself a gender therapist. And this was before I even knew that I was non-binary,
Hmm.
because back then I only still had, when I think about it, I think I had one non-binary client. And this was someone who was still in high school. Excuse me. And so my exposure to what it means to be non-binary was extremely limited. So I'm kind of like on that side of things where a lot of people who are non-binary, where it's like, I didn't even know that it was a thing. And then once I heard it was a thing, I was like, holy crap, I think that's me.
Right.
So, so the timing was sort of funny where I had already been working with trans clients and gender questioning clients since probably like 2007. So it had been a few years, but it really was this moment of me realizing that at least 75% of my clients were trans. At that point, I had gone to plenty of trainings and workshops and worked with so many clients. And then the local newspaper called me a gender therapist. And that was really, I was like, okay, it's official. I think, I don't know if I suggest that's what everybody does, but for me, that was like pretty cool. And I think at that same month, I also won an award locally from our Pride Center. And I also presented at a conference. So I was like, okay, I'm going to go ahead and claim this as an area of expertise, because this really seems like this is something I'm really interested in, and people see me as this kind of person. But, that's just like really the beginning of it. After that, besides just being able to help people in my office, I really wanted to take things out of my office. And so that's another part of what I just wanted to share with your audience that I do is in 2013 is when I started. I called it my blog at the time. Now it's more just like a website hub
Hmm.
called Conversations with a Gender Therapist, and just started writing informational articles to help people understand what it means to be trans and gender questioning. And it turns out that people were really interested. And so I just kept doing that. And then I created a Facebook page. And then 2014, I created a YouTube channel. And then in 2016 is when I published a book, to help people discover their gender identity. So at this point in time, I'm seeing clients, and I would say most of my clients are either gender an or trans, or they're in the process of transitioning. And at the same time, I'm also doing a lot outside of my office as an educator and as an advocate. So that's that part of the story. Do you have any questions about that?
Yeah. I mean, was there, did that just kind of happen organically, or was that a conscious decision that, because you said that this was kind of your thing before you realized that you were non-binary, but you'd figured out that most of your clients were gender non-conforming or gender questioning of some flavor. So did that just sort of happen organically, or did you specifically seek those folks out? Like, how did that work?
Sure. You know what? I would say it's important to know that where I work and live right now, it's Colorado Springs, Colorado, and especially back when I first started, which was my private practice is 10 years old this month. Colorado Springs was known as the evangelical capital of the world when it came to. There's New Life Church here. There's Focus on the Family, and many, many other evangelical churches. And so there's really a big need for people who are just in general queer and trans to find a therapist who they were going to be able to go to, who not only knew something about this, but wouldn't then either, say that they were being sinful and doing something wrong, or that they were just like, oh, sweetie, you're just really mentally ill, that kind of thing. Like that was a definite realistic threat to people. And so when I got out of graduate school, the first thing I did was actually work at our local Pride Center for a while. And through that, I got to know a lot of the people in the community. I myself already knew that I was at the very least gay. And so, I was able to, that's where I met people who were transgender for, as far as I knew, for the first time. So I got a lot of good experience there. And then I opened up my private practice, and I already had resources. People already knew, like, oh, Dara's somebody that you could go to and you'll be safe there. I called my business, or call my business, the Bohemian Sanctuary, like just,
Nice.
and it's also like people who are poly and kink and, atheists. It's like this, you can come here and you don't have to worry that you're going to have a therapist that's going to judge you. And so from there, people just sort of by word of mouth were able to hear about me and come my way. So that really was, it felt so good to provide that need. It really sucks that that need was there. And I would say present day, both there are more practitioners now in town who can help, and the town itself has grown and changed in a lot of ways, becoming a bit more progressive. There's still more work to do, but it's still a lot different than it was 10 years ago. And so, but by the time things kind of evened out, I had already, I guess, gained sort of a reputation as kind of the go-to gender therapist in town. So thus, I still continue to have quite a few clients that come my way.
That's awesome. Yeah. And speaking to the need, it's so important. And you had mentioned the fact that, there's not like a board that certifies that you're a gender therapist. Like you just kind of have to self-actualize that you've reached a level of competence that that's a thing you can say. And that speaks to the fact, like, I know so many trans folks who have gone to therapists that say they are trans competent and trans friendly and trans welcoming and had terrible experiences. I mean, I had an experience. I don't know that I would like, it wasn't traumatic, but it definitely felt gross. When I called her and initially I introduced myself as my dead name and I just said, hey, I've got some feels happening. I think this might be a thing. And I want to talk to somebody professionally about it to figure out what I need to do, if anything. And we made an appointment, and the appointment was like, it was like 3 weeks after I talked to her because she was super booked up. And I went to her. By the time that I'd went to her, I was like, yeah, I actually figured out this is a thing for me. And like, and I was dressed femme and like introduced myself to her as my name instead of my dead name. And she just like, she got this kind of like sneer on her face. Like, have you even thought about this? Do you have a plan? And I'm like, oh my God, like I left my house to come to a therapy appointment. I'm not like jumping off a cliff into a river here. Like I was so put off by that. And I've heard so many experiences that range from like just kind of gross to like outright traumatic. And I'm curious on like, I'm not a fan of gatekeeping generally, but like sometimes it makes sense. Is that a thing that you think should be a thing? Like, should there be like a board of specialists that certify that like, yes, you are trans competent and you can call yourself this thing? Should there be a level of certification for that?
Well, firstly, I think that's awful that happened to you. And sadly, I have heard, just as you have, similar stories from clients coming to me and, for instance, saying, well, I was with this one therapist and they said I had to come see them for a year before I can get a hormone therapy letter. And I'm like, oh, dear God. I said, I know a physician here in town who uses informed consent. You do not even need a letter from a therapist.
Right.
And they're like, oh, that's wonderful. I wish I had known that already. So it's not, yeah, like you said, not even, besides even somebody who's going to then approach this in a really inappropriate way, there's even misinformation given where they think they know the current standards of care of what's going on. And it turns out so therefore that therapist sounds very knowledgeable and aware, like, oh yes, well, we must see each other for this much time. And it turns out they are, wherever they got their information, it's old. And it's hard to find on the internet sometimes what is most current. So what's interesting is that WPATH, which is the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, who create the standards of care, they have a certification process, and I feel like it's in its infantile stage where they're trying it out, seeing how it works. And so there's also a way you can get I think they call it grandfathered, but that's really gendered.
Right.
Grandparented in so I haven't, it looks a little complicated, honestly, which is why I haven't done it. But I also know, I mean, people are still going to come see me, even if they're not going to be like, so do you have that WPATH certification yet?
Right.
But it's possible that at some point in the future, this is my guess, is that if it goes well and if people actually start going through the certification process, I certainly would be curious about it and would go through it for that reason. And then my guess is that it'll be something you can add to your name and say, I am a WPATH certified gender therapist. And so maybe some people will start to pick up on that and notice that that looks like that person's even one more step further in terms of their awareness and knowledge than someone who just says they're a generic gender therapist. So I wonder if things might go in that direction. I think it's almost too late for it to become something where everybody must, be certified to do this, or else you can't do it, because there's too many of us out there right now who are like, I'm a gender therapist. So maybe that'll be something that in the future, just to kind of let your audience know that they can maybe look for that is something that's in progress. And it's possible that if that works out, that maybe that'll be something people can look out for when they're looking for a gender therapist.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. I just, the hair stands up on the back of my head immediately, because like when I think of things like that, I automatically think of gatekeeping. And if like those standards are done and they're done wrong, then it could do a whole lot of harm. But, if they're done right, it could be a good thing. So it's just, I don't know, it's just one of those things that just immediately makes me very, very nervous.
I understand that. And honestly, I'm going to start getting more involved with WPATH, just so I can continue to not only be a member, but maybe at some point, who knows, like maybe even join the board or help out with writing the new standards of care. Right now, I just kind of admire from afar. And the good news is that there's a lot of people, even with the last standards of care, there's a lot of people who actually are trans and transgender who are a part of the process of creating those standards of care. And the next standards of care, I've seen like a table of contents, there's going to be a whole chapter about non-binary identities. And
oh, that's fantastic.
It seems like you said, it's such a tricky thing, because it's like, here's these standards of care, and they're not meant to be gatekeepy, but practitioners can interpret them kind of like the Bible, like in a gatekeepy way if they want to. And therefore, it's best to avoid such practitioners because they're not necessarily using it with the best intentions.
Right. So if you're okay, I'd really like to dive into the sort of being a mental health professional, helping people who sometimes are in the same station you are in life. Because for me, that would be just incredibly difficult for me to do on a professional level. Like on a friend level, just talking to somebody, giving them advice, helping them bounce ideas off the wall, that kind of stuff. Like that stuff is, I'm okay at that, I feel like. But on a professional level, like obviously there's a certain distance that you have to keep professionally with your clients and your patients. And I think that would be incredibly difficult for me, especially if it's someone who is in a similar position to me. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think that's a really cool question. Excuse me. When I first started counseling, so I think I've had enough practice over the years of it coming up in different ways where it's, I kind of know what to do with it. It's not that it's not difficult when it comes up, but I'm better at being able to navigate it. Because, for instance, when I first started counseling, I ended up with quite a few clients who were what I call late blooming lesbians, where they were like me, they had been married or were married to a man in this case, but they're pretty sure they might be lesbian. And this is what at the time my experience was. And so when I would get clients like this, I recognize, like, wow, this is like really interesting. It's very close to my story in some ways not. So that was like my earliest memories of something coming up that felt very personal, very, like we had a lot in common, and recognizing, what do I need to do to make sure that I'm not going to, I think you had mentioned just like either over empathizing or not being able to be like a proper neutral party in that. So it took practice, that's for sure. And I would not ever say that I'm perfect at it, but it takes being able to recognize at what point you do need to kind of, step yourself aside and just be there for the client. But sometimes sharing that information can be really useful. I went to a conference recently where they had an entire session about that. Like, what do you do as a practitioner if you are trans and your client is trans? And how much do you disclose? When does it get weird that you're disclosing too much? When is it that it actually helps create more safety and reassurance with the client? So I think it takes, like I mentioned, some practice in doing that. And it also depends on the client. If you feel like they can take that information in a useful way, and then it not accidentally slip into like, oh my gosh, now maybe we can be best friends.
Right.
And I've made that mistake before it's happened. And so, sometimes that's how you learn. But, more present day, I noticed that this definitely happens with clients I have who are non-binary or who are questioning if they're non-binary, since that is my more recent identity discovery. And even though I've been aware for several years now that I'm non-binary, it's really been within the last, I'd say since about a year ago, that I was really sunk deep into this awareness of myself. And so since then, I have been able to tell, especially if it's somebody who is assigned female at birth, like myself, and moving more towards masculinization, then it feels kind of like it's brand new again to me, where it's like, oh, I remember what this was like to have this feeling of like, wow, this client and I really have a lot in common. And, how do I be appropriate in talking about this? So I would say in this case, I would say this has been even more challenging than my previous example. And I feel like it's because this, in terms of not being non-binary, it's still something that isn't really talked about as much and known about by as many people as we would like. And so it feels like that camaraderie immediately is formed between one another. Like they'll say, oh, I know you're non-binary. That's why I want you to be my therapist. And then there's like a moment of like, yeah, like that's great. And then, reminding myself, sometimes I'll even talk out loud with the client and say, since I am non-binary, but we obviously have different experiences, I might from time to time share something that's personal, but I also want to keep an eye on, if this is going to be useful to you or not. So it's really totally fine to have an open conversation with your client and then to ask them if there are certain things that they think would be helpful for you to share. And then you can just kind of play it by ear in that way.
Yeah, that's interesting. And, sometimes when I have conversations with folks, it goes back and forth because sometimes I feel like, especially if, congruent to your example, if someone's coming to me as a trans woman and saying, like, well, these are the feelings that I'm having. This is the way that I feel. I think I might be trans or I am trans and I'm trying to figure out how to deal with it. There are some times where like I start to feel kind of maternal about it and I'm like, ooh, like I get to help hatch a baby transling and it feels very good. And like I get to help this person, using whatever experience that I have, and obviously reminding at every step along the way that like I can share, I'm happy to share every bit of my experience, but that's my experience. And, you talk to 100 different people and you get 100 different stories because everybody's different. But the thing that happens to me sometimes that I would maybe expect might happen in a situation like yours is the opposite thing, where somebody's telling me about an experience that they had that's particularly bad that I have an experience with, like, like we're talking about dysphoria and I'm having a bad dysphoria day. And, it kind of like throws me back into that when we have that conversation. And there have even been times where I've been in the middle of conversations like that. And I've had to be like, you know what, like, I really like, I want the best for you. Here's a couple of websites, but like, I have to step away from this because I'm not in a good headspace right now. And so like, I'm curious, have you had any experiences along those lines?
Oh, sure. One of the benefits, if you were to pursue becoming a counselor, is that in graduate school, they're very aware, when I say they, the teachers and whatnot, the instructors, that this is something that can happen constantly for therapists. It could be someone who does addiction counseling and they themselves have gone through addiction, trauma, all sorts of examples of where there could be something in a session that could be potentially triggering. And so, they work with us. About how you can handle this. And so, the first thing, again, it's just after several years of doing it, you get better at it. But the other thing is personality wise, I'm pretty good at compartmentalizing, which sometimes is great. But then when it comes to my personal life, it might not, it's a defense mechanism.
Right. Yeah.
But, in counseling, it works pretty good. So I'm able to, if something comes up, I can pretty quickly recognize, let's say in my body, whether it's a feeling or a sense of my body, that's, obviously that's a thing that has been hard for me. Like you said, it could even be that day if we're talking about misgendering and nobody knows that, not to use just he and she out in the world. I'm being misgendered all the time. I could be in myself, be like, yep, that just happened to me 3 times today. Being able to recognize that came up in me, and then whatever I do in terms of like, a compartmentalizing sort of motion in that moment for myself and putting it aside. At the end of the session, I'll check in with myself to see, is it still there? Do I need to do a little something, a little self-care, message somebody who cares about me and just say, oh, that was hard. Or even, having a different therapist to chat about with it, just to deprogram, process it with somebody. You just kind of have your tricks and tools already ready just in case that happens. I was taken by surprise a couple weeks ago. I have a client who at the time was identifying as non-binary, but they were suspecting that they might actually be a trans man. And I noticed that I was really surprised because it struck me in a certain way, but I didn't want to try to figure it out during the session. Like, what did that just bring up in me? So I made sure to take note, don't forget that part of the session. So I was able to stay focused. Then after the session, I thought about it and I realized that I had a part of me that was a little jealous, and that I was like, sometimes I wish I was more binary, because being able to say, oh, it turns out I'm a man, then there's this more clear path, which is a myth, of course, but clear path of transitioning. And, because this client was saying, well, I've been being called sir a lot lately, and it's been feeling really good. And I thought to myself, oh, that does not feel good to me though. And then that's when I recognized later, I was like, well, I think I'm actually a little jealous. And so I realized I had to work a little bit on my own sense of frustration and even shame about the invisibility of being non-binary, and recognizing that a part of me, which I can understand and be compassionate about, I wish that even if it meant I was trans, that I was binary trans. And so in that case, I was able to even use that as maybe as a positive, because I didn't let it disrupt the session itself or my ability to be there for the client, but I was able to use it for a moment of self-reflection.
Yeah. Well, and I think that goes back to, I think what is often a very basic human need, that our lives not be quite as complicated as they are sometimes. Like, like we can recognize the sometimes problematic nature of, internalized transphobia. Like, no, I don't hate that I'm trans. I just wish it wasn't so damn hard.
Right. That is so true. That's true. I'll remind myself of that.
Yeah. Well, and that's, I had a friend ask me once after, we had this hours long conversation about, this is somebody I'd known for like 7 or 8 years at the time that I came out. And he was like, I'm going to ask kind of an awkward question, if that's okay. And I'm like, man, we are way past awkward right now. Like, what do you got? And he was like, if you could go back and like flip a switch and just make yourself cis, would you? And my immediate reaction was like, yeah, I don't want to struggle with all of this stuff that I've been like working over my entire life. I would love to not have that struggle. But then I thought to myself, like, but I like myself. I like who I am as a person. And if I went back and flipped that switch, I wouldn't be who I am anymore. And there's always that push and pull between, like, I know that my life would be far less hard if I was not trans, but like, I also really, really like who I am. And aside from like, the stuff like everybody has things about themselves that they would like to change. Like, I wish I was more patient. I wish, that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. But like, generally speaking, I like myself as a person, and I wouldn't be myself if that. So yeah, there's that constant push and pull that I think I would confidently declare it's nigh universal among humanity in one sense or another. So yeah, don't beat yourself up too hard over that.
Yeah, I think you potentially could be a good therapist. I hear it.
Oh,
yeah, that's a good point. You're differentiating between, like you said, if there's like an internalized transphobia going on versus, it's just, really freaking tough. Yeah. And it's okay to wish sometimes this wasn't how it was. But, being able to tell the difference between, is this something where they then actually hate this about themselves and in others?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'm curious, you had mentioned someone who initially was identifying themselves as non-binary, but was thinking they might actually be a trans man, or a binary trans person. And so, the book that you have is about helping folks explore their gender identity and kind of help figure themselves out. And I'm really curious about this, because a lot of folks come to me with questions like this, like, I'm feeling X way and I'm wondering if that makes me trans. And, my thing is like, if you're asking the question, there's gotta be something there. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're trans, but like, maybe just like general gender feels, maybe you're a woman, but you don't fit stereotypically feminine roles. And so there's a difference there, something along those lines. And my thing is like, I just do the Socratic thing because it's very important for me, especially as a person who is not an expert, to not try to lead people in one direction or another, and just sort of like ask questions back to people that may help them sort of explore things. And I had a conversation with someone who had come out as a gay man, and like through our conversations in my head, I am thinking, we're going to be having another conversation in about 6 months about you being a trans woman. I would never say that. I would never, ever say that because I don't want to lead someone down that path. But in my head, that's what I was thinking. And it happened that way. Like that's exactly what happened. But so I'm curious about the sort of process of helping folks work through this. I mean, obviously, you don't have to give the entire book away, but I'm just sort of curious about sort of the general philosophy of the process and how you kind of work through that with folks.
So something I like so much about this question is that this is definitely a question I felt like I was running into struggles with, and not necessarily as a therapist, but it was because as a therapist, you have the time and the space to be able to let a client explore this, and you meet, over periods of weeks or months, and you really get to know them and they get to know you. You get to really start exploring what are these different obstacles in their way when it comes to fears and logistics. So my challenge was that I was receiving, because of my Facebook page and my blog and my YouTube channel, I was receiving a lot of messages from people across the world where they would do kind of like you're saying. It could be pretty short email, here's this. So am I trans? And I realized pretty quickly, like, this is not something I can answer quickly or even something I want to answer. This is something I strongly believe that, for instance, as a therapist, I can help guide that person and, kind of stand by their side as they figure this out for themselves. So that's even, another additional important step to it. So the reason I wrote the book is because I did have so many people asking me if I could help them with that, but then it was something where they just wanted it to be, something pretty quick to be able to figure out. And so that's when I wrote the book. And especially after I wrote the book, I was like, whoa, this could be like a really lengthy process for people to figure out. But it's kind of like being able to try to have like a gender therapist inside a book for you to be able to see what are some of these questions that are important to ask yourself. And so I broke the book up into 3 different sections because I felt like it was important. And, people can skip parts and do whatever they want. But for me, it was important for people to know that the best thing you can do first, I pattern it after the hero's journey. So if you prepare yourself first ahead of time, because it actually is going to be potentially kind of a scary and challenging journey to go on to find these answers. And so like for preparation, I encourage people to really, really figure out, why do I actually need to know the truth? Like, where is it that I've gotten to in my life where this has become unsustainable? I can't not answer this question anymore. And then really having to figure out, what are they afraid of when it comes to trying to figure it out? And I noticed that a lot of people, like once you start digging in there a little bit, if it's somebody who, for instance, like you said, let's say it's a cisgender woman, and it turns out that they really just aren't comfortable with being stereotyped, it doesn't take that long until they're like, oh, no, actually these questions about being trans don't really connect with me. Like, I feel like this is actually more of who I am. Everybody else kind of stays around, lingers a bit more, and like, I don't know, tell me more. This
Right.
sounds pretty, maybe we're onto something here. And so the second part of the book has to do with reflection. And I do have people answer a lot of questions about their childhood and their growing up years, because those can really act as very information-filled memories and things that you did to, even if you didn't know it, were you doing to cope with gender dysphoria, if that's what was going on. With this client in particular, the third part of my book, which has to do with exploration, I feel like that's what he is using male pronouns now, was doing. So basically he spent several months just making slow and gradual changes socially, in terms of different haircut, different clothing style. He did actually even change his name because his previous name was very feminine. and just lived as that for a while. How does this feel? It's an experimentation. Sometimes you don't know until you actually just start making some of those changes and seeing how it feels. And so what happened was that, it felt like a certain amount of certainty settled in terms of, oh, this stuff is really who I am not. That's for sure. And then just kind of got to a point where it felt like maybe it was right, but then there was like this point where, he started to recognize like, oh, being called sir or mistaken for he, like that's really feeling really good too. And then what it turns out is there was this block in his way that he didn't realize, which was that he started utilizing resources, which is what I encourage people to do. He was reading a book written by a trans man, and this person was talking about how afraid he was to admit he was a man because for much of his life, he just hated toxic masculinity and therefore was afraid of a lot of men. And then my client was like, oh my God, that's me. And then it was this realization almost all at the same time, like I actually really am a man and I'm scared to death of being a man in this society because I don't want to be that person. So that right there was like, yay, new material for us to work with in therapy, because he wanted to be able to go ahead and transition so he could be more comfortable, but then recognizing like there's going to be a lot of discomfort that's going to come with this as I gain male privilege. And in fact, he started to recognize he was already gaining male privilege and could see just how uncomfortable it was making him.
Yeah, I'm curious about the exploration of childhood, because one of the things when I was very, very first gaining the vocabulary to question who I was, because it's something I've realized on one level or another since I was like 10, but I didn't have the concepts or the vocabulary to recognize what being transgender was, or even that it was a thing. Like in my head, I was a boy who wanted to be a girl, and that was the most complicated, nuanced explanation that I had the tools to give of the way that I felt at the time. And one of the things that I sort of beat myself up over is I would hear so many people say that like, well, they gave me action figures and I wanted to play with Barbies and that kind of stuff. And I'm thinking to myself, like, I was actually cool with action figures. Like I loved my Transformers. I loved my G.I. Joes. I loved my Ninja Turtles. And like, again, I was like way pre-understanding like that, gender roles don't matter in that way. Like there are plenty of girls who like playing with action figures. That doesn't mean you aren't one, but in my head I hadn't, that was a roadblock for me. The fact that I didn't have that sort of stereotypical, I loved everything stereotypically feminine as a kid experience. Like that wasn't my personal experience. And that was kind of one of the things that made me doubt myself.
Yes, you know what? It comes up so often. Like you said, it's almost like looking back, it's like, oh, but it's fine. Like, things shouldn't be gendered. But, unfortunately, there has been such a history in mental health, let's say, for instance, before this was more explored, that there were therapists who were looking for those kind of gender stereotypes in order to be able to diagnose somebody as transgender and at the time they would call it transsexual. And therefore you can now be approved for things like hormones and surgery. So there was this pressure for people to come in and be able to say like, well, yes, here are all these femme things that I like. And I wish, here's all these girly things and these womanly things. And, the therapist being, oh, good. It sounds like you truly are a woman then. Like that really was how it was. And it was extremely detrimental because it then therefore made this whole like, am I trans enough sort of thing, start at a certain point where someone's like, well, that's not really me, because like you said, there's some things I liked when I was younger that were really boy kind of stuff. So maybe I'm not really, a girl. So, oh, well, like that. And then people would stop exploring it. Yeah, it was still tormenting them deep down. So I think you're right that nowadays, when somebody is a really aware gender therapist and they have a client that starts talking about these confusions about, but I liked this, but I liked that, does that really mean this is who I am? Just continuing to remind them and hit home that idea of, these things that you're interested in do not determine what your gender is. And especially because like as a child, you're raised a certain way, so you're exposed to certain things. And therefore maybe you're just it just was lucky, just a coincidence. Like, here's the toys that you got to play with. And you're like, yeah, I like those toys. For other kids, it was like, I don't really like those toys. It just happened to be that for you, they aligned with you. So I think that is really important to help people to avoid slipping into the am I trans enough mentality to be able to continue to point that out.
Yeah. And so what things do you look for? Like, because one of the things that you talked about was, asking questions of folks about their childhood to sort of explore, like, were you trying to cope with gender dysphoria in one way or another? And so, like, just speaking sort of generally, what sorts of things are you looking for there?
Oh, sure. So I would say specifically when it comes to childhood, so this will be different. This is kind of like pre-puberty.
Mm-hmm.
There's almost like this sort of sense of innocence in which, asking people, and I usually don't ask them direct questions, but it might be that they share and say, I used to go to night and pray that I would wake up the next day as a girl.
Mm-hmm.
Or I used to blow out my birthday candles and wish that, like, my wish is I wish I could be a girl. And even if they're at the time, they're like, I don't know why I'm wishing for that or praying for this. This is really, and then they just kind of like feel embarrassed and ashamed about it. But they can oftentimes pull up these memories once they're given permission to share it. And so something else I want to mention just while we're talking about this is that it is also totally okay if somebody did not realize in childhood or even when they were a teenager that this is what was going on with them, because there can be things going on in childhood that were way more distracting. There could be like, a lot of family trauma and addiction, alcoholism, just a lot of distractions. That kid could have gone through some different of their own learning disabilities, anything that could be, because a lot of people feel like, well, what if I don't remember feeling like this as a kid or thinking about this. Some people were raised in a very gender neutral home and it wasn't a big deal that they, were the way they were. So it's important to recognize that it's okay if somebody doesn't have these kind of memories. So moving into puberty, it becomes a little bit more clear because it's like, how did you feel about puberty? The changes that your body was going through, and then looking at the changes going on with other people and comparing yourself to that. How was that? And so that can be a really, I'm sure as you can understand, like a really big question for someone to sit with. And that could even just physically just even bring up that sense of dysphoria and that sadness or confusion or anger that person probably had during puberty. And so I feel like that's really important to ask about, but can potentially be a very painful experience to reflect on because of not realizing at the time that there was more than likely really strong gender dysphoria present.
Yeah, well, and that's actually my personal experience. So pre-puberty, I was pretty much good with everything, aside from the fact that I, at the time was perceived as being a slightly more emotional boy than most boys were. But again, like I was cool with action figures. I played sports, like all of that stuff, and I was fine with all of that. But yeah, it was really puberty for me and figuring out like, hey, the way those bodies are changing is, I think that's supposed to be what's going on with me. And, that again, like that was the most sophisticated way that I had been given to describe that experience. So yeah, that's super interesting.
Part of the chapter, the section where I talk about that, I also encourage the reader to then take some time to explore any shame or guilt that they might have, because potentially that started off when they were young, when it comes to, their gender identity. And because that a lot of times can be one of the blocks that's in the way of allowing themselves to explore this, because it just gets, they might make a little progress thinking about something that may be like, oh, maybe this is who I am. And then like this shame ball or this guilt ball just comes in and they're like, oh, no, I don't, never mind. This isn't what's happening. To have a therapist be able to walk you through that and point out like, wow, I just saw you were just talking about something that sounded like you made progress. And then you just started talking about how this is just going to crush your parents if they were to find out about this. And then you just shut down. And so let's pause and let's think about, let's look more closely at that shame piece or that guilt piece that you have. So I think that, as someone's trying to figure out their gender identity, it's important to continuously pay attention to what comes up as fear or as shame or as guilt, because those are going to be it's like in a video game, like it's just going to be these challenges there, whether it's a dragon or some kind of fireball, like that is going to be continuously thrown in your path as you're trying to figure out these questions.
So the next book is Transition the RPG.
I mean, I use these analogies all the time, so I think that totally makes sense.
That's so good. Yes, your hormones are your potions, and
Nice.
oh my God,
I'm surprised someone else come up with that.
that's our $1 million idea. We're gonna do quests, and we're gonna have XP, and there's gonna be, oh my God, my wife is very, very into this whole thing, and she's a developer. I'm gonna see what her thoughts are on that.
Yeah, go with it, because it is not a copyrighted idea by any means. You came up with it.
It was at least Dara inspired, at least.
There you go. We could do that. You can name one of the characters in it after me. How's that?
Yeah. So, the other thing that I'm curious about is I have a kind of a weird relationship with labels, because labels are important because we need words to describe the things that we feel and how we fit in with our peers in society. But I think sometimes that spills over into like feeling like you have to fit yourself inside of a box. And the thing that I always like, the advice that I always try to give is like, figure out who you are and then maybe try to find a label that fits that best, as opposed to figuring out like, well, am I transgender? Am I non-binary? Am I a man? Am I a woman? My thing is like, well, let's forget about those words for a second. Like, obviously we can't remove that context completely because of the world that we live in, because those are things that matter about, how you interact with the world. But like, let's remove that from the conversation just for a second and just say like, in your ideal world, like what would your personal style be? What do you have dysphoria around certain body parts of yours that like you wish that you could have some sort of surgery to change or hormones to change or anything like that? Is that a reasonable approach? Because I hate feeling like I'm feeding into and validating the idea that we have to have labels and that we have to have boxes to fit in. And I feel like it's really easy to fall into that trap, and I try really hard not to. So I'm curious on your thoughts about sort of walking that line.
It's interesting. That is exactly what I say in my book. 100% is that I'm not exactly sure, but I hope I said it early on in the book, is that what can feel so overwhelming about trying to figure this out is trying to go for a certain endpoint and thinking that there needs to be, even if it's by mistake, you're thinking there is a certain box that you need to land in and have this certain word to describe yourself. And almost word for what you said, I say, let's just forget about labels for a while and let's just explore these very specific topics. And as you explore them, you might be tempted to keep thinking, oh, that must mean that I'm not this or I am this. And just keep exploring and answering these questions for yourself. And then at the end of the book, I then say, okay, now it's time, if you want to put a label on this, that we can work on this, because I have them gather all of the information they learned about themselves, in this sort of collective format, and then they can look at the big picture of it. And then I say, now if you want to put a label on this, then here's different ways that we can go about doing it. Even then I say, you can just, if you want to know, like I am trans, or I am a woman, or I am non-binary, or, for other people, it's like, I feel like I'm potentially, a queer, trans feminine woman, or whatever it is. Like I remind them, you can use all sorts of terms, you can change your terms, you might have to use some terms with your physician, and you can use other terms with your best friends, because that's what society's like. You might have to figure that out as you go along. And so I 100% agree. You're absolutely right that I think it can really help reduce that sense of overwhelm if you can first approach this without worrying about where you're headed with it. And then when you get to that point, when you're ready for it, you just gather your information together and then decide what you want to do about it.
Very cool. So the last thing that I want to ask is, I don't remember who it was, but this was not an original thought to me. This is actually, I was talking with a cis person, and they were just sort of asking me questions about being trans. And as long as someone's approaching the conversation in good faith, I'll answer almost any question anyone has. And he brought up the fact that he's like, I don't mean to come off as insensitive, but if you think about it in a way, you're kind of lucky. And I was like, what the hell are you talking about? Like, what is, and he's like, well, most people don't have to do the kind of self-exploration you've had to do. And so obviously there's difficulty, right? And it shouldn't be that difficult. And I feel for the difficulty of that. But in some ways, I feel like maybe it's a gift that you've done so much self-exploration. Like, you've probably learned more about yourself than most quote unquote normal people ever have to do. And like, that kind of blew my mind because again, like, there's that dichotomy of like, well, yeah, I like who I am, but I wish it wasn't so damn hard. And then to like turn around and think of it like, gosh, yeah, in a sense. And obviously there's a spectrum of experience there, right? Because there are lots of people who have very serious trauma surrounding these things that would gladly erase all of this if it meant, they didn't have to go through those things. But, it's been severely difficult at times, but I wouldn't call it traumatic for me. And so in some ways, I actually have started to see this as kind of a gift, because I really have had to think more deeply about myself than I feel like a lot of people do. And I'm just wondering if you have thoughts on that.
I think this is a safe audience I can share this with, but I remember recently I was at a local gathering, and it was just a bunch of therapists that we get together sometimes for dinner. And I just realized at a certain point I was just really bored in this gathering, and I messaged with a queer therapist that I know, and I was like, I don't know, like, I just kind of wish I wasn't here. This is really boring. And I said, oh my God, I think it's because none of them are queer. Like, that's terrible. Why would I say that? Like, and they said the same thing that you just did and that your friend did, was like, I think that as queer people, we've just had to do a lot of like unrepressing and figuring some pretty important shit out. And that therefore has led us to be more authentic and real. And therefore we're more interesting. And I was like, oh, that's an interesting point. Of course, not saying this is 100% across the board for those who are not queer, but I definitely think there's something to be said that, whatever it is, if there's something else where somebody really has needed to be able to go through that process, then yeah, I do think it's kind of magical. Then it's, you're almost put in that corner where you're like, if you don't face this, your life is going to suck, and potentially you might not even want to live. And so I do wish that everybody in the world was able to then have that sort of sense of urgency about, self-discovery. But, those of us who are queer, I think that there is sort of this, especially the way our society is currently, it's set up that way. If there is something that's like it's not the majority, then I think potentially that's something that people can easily repress in childhood and therefore need to do all that self-exploration in adulthood or, in young adulthood.
Very cool. Well, this has been a super, super interesting conversation, and I learned a lot, which is always my favorite episodes, are the things where I learn a lot, because I just like to do episodes about things that I'm curious about, because I feel like that's always going to be the most, at least the stuff that I'm going to be the most excited about. So I really, really appreciate your time and your insights. If you want to just promote all of the things, tell us where we can find all of your stuff on the web.
Yeah, this has been a really fun interview. Thank you so much for having me on your show. One thing I want to mention is that I do have a coupon offer for your listeners if they're interested in getting my book. The book is You and Your Gender Identity, A Guide to Discovery. And the name of the website is discoveryourgenderidentity.com. And you can use coupon code podcast to get 10% off. I will admit that you can also, if it's more economically beneficial for you to go to Amazon to get the book, then that's totally cool. If you buy it directly from my website, obviously I get almost the full cost of the book to support my small business. But I also sign the book, and you also get a free copy of the PDF of the book in case you want to read it on your laptop or on your mobile device. So that's the information for the book. My main website is darahoffmanfox.com, and that's where I have about 5 years worth of articles, information. All my videos are linked there, because you could also go to YouTube and look up my name or look up Conversations with a Gender Therapist and find them there. Then also I have a Facebook page called Conversations with a Gender Therapist. At this point, it has I know nowadays with Facebook, it doesn't matter if like 22,000 people like it, but 22,000 2,000 people like it. So it's pretty cool. There's a group that you can join that specifically is for the book, but you don't have to prove anything that you've read the book. It's totally okay. So you can just go to Facebook and look up You and Your Gender Identity, A Guide to Discovery, and it's a closed group that you can join. And right now I think there's almost 5,000 people in it. And acts a lot like a support group. There's a few moderators in there, make sure things don't get weird. So let me think. If anybody out there is a therapist, I have started to create an academy, the Trans Affirming Therapist Academy. It's an online school. So there's courses. I have one so far, and it's about non-binary clients. But you can just type in, you can either go to my Dara Hoffman-Fox website for that, or you can just type in Trans Affirming Therapist Academy, and it'll bring you to the teachable.com website, and you can start learning more about my school there.
Very cool. And if you're driving, I will have all of those links in the show notes for you to refer to back to later. So please be safe. All of those links will be in the show notes for the episode. Dara, once again, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Kelly. You have a great night.
And that, my friends, is going to do it for this episode of the Gaytheist Manifesto. If you think what we do here is important, please share this around to your friends. Search the Gaytheist Manifesto on Facebook and Twitter to find us there. I'm at Gaytheist Callie on Twitter, and you can email us at podcast@thegaytheistmanifesto.com. If you want to support the show and the activism we do, you can head to patreon.com/thegaytheistmanifesto, make a per episode donation as little as $1 per episode. And if you can't do that, you can still give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts and share us around to your friends. It all helps, and it all makes a difference. Before we go, I want you to know that if you're lost, you're hurting, you're scared, if you feel like no one cares and no one understands, you need to know there's a community out here that loves you, cares for you, knows that you're capable of amazing things, and that you are worthy of love. If you're struggling, please don't be afraid to reach out. Until next time, friends, this is the Gaytheist Manifesto.